Welcome to the On List. Today, episode 2, will be the first actual On List video on this channel here. So, I figured I would kick things off kind of easy, kind of laid back, and make the first official On List about my all-time favorite fragrances, or a small selection of them. I'm not going to run through all of my favorites because this would be a 2-hour video if I did that. But as the first official On List video on this channel, I will be talking about some of my all-time favorites and why they're my favorites. But first, you should probably know that most of my favorite fragrances directly correlate with my most worn fragrances, because unlike some people who will name their favorite fragrances based on nostalgia or sentimentality, but then when you look at what they're actually wearing, if they track their wears on a site like Base Notes or Fragrantica, you realize that the things they say are their favorite fragrance versus the things they're actually reaching for the most, they don't line up. They don't meet parity. So me, I take a more pragmatic and logical approach to favorites, and I just say, well, this is the thing I've worn the most in my life, so this must be my favorite fragrance, regardless of what my heart tells me, right? It's what I'm actually grabbing and wearing that's my favorite fragrance. So, with that in mind, let's get started. I've found most of my favorite fragrances / most worn fragrances are also pretty humble ones too. Stuff that I discovered relatively early on in my fragrance journey, which I wasn't even on a journey then. I was just buying stuff because I liked it. And once I started going online and researching and writing reviews and getting really in the weeds, I never really changed out for anything new. Most of the things that were my favorite fragrance, say 20 years ago, for example, 80% of that stuff is still my favorite, still the fragrances that I reach for the most, for better or for worse. That's just how it is. There have been a couple of new things that have crept in since then, like once I really started getting active on Base Notes, once I really started doing more research into the background of compositions, how fragrances are made, and I started exploring more. Yeah, a couple of things have since then crept into my favorites list, and I have worn the mess out of them. I can't really swear, so I feel kind of weird to have to like censor myself here to say words like heck and whatever. It's I'm not used to this yet, so being PG or whatever to avoid being buried by the algorithm. But anyway, so without further ado, let's get started. I think my most worn fragrance of all time, and like I said, I don't really do sequenced lists. The whole idea of unlist is not to actually go best to worst or worst to best, but in this one exception, I can actually tell you my top favorite most worn fragrance of all time. The rest of them I don't really try to rank, but I at least know what number one is, and that is Black Suede, released in 1980 by Avon Products. Those of you who know me, you probably know that I collect a lot of Avon. I have a whole separate Avon collection that's not even integrated with the rest of my fragrances. And I'm not getting into the history of that. That could take up a lot of time. But I will say that one of the fragrances that really sent me down that particular rabbit hole was Black Suede. And for me, when I first smelled it, when I was a teenager, I just thought it was the sexiest thing, most confident, mature smelling thing. Bear in mind, this was back before any of us were really conscious about things like, trends or hype or anything like that. So I actually think it's kind of weird that these days people will smell a fragrance like Black Suede and go, oh, that smells like an old man, or why are you wearing that? You're not going to be cool if you wear that. But back in the late 90s, when I was a teenager, I didn't care that Black Suede came out in 1980. I probably didn't even know that it came out in 1980 when I discovered it. It just smelled amazing and I wore it, right? And I feel like that's something to be said, that people take the dates of fragrance release and the genre they are in a little too seriously with trend relevance and all of that. And it has to smell youthful, it has to smell mature, this or that and the other. Like, if you're not, one of those terminally online frag bro types that gets too into things in the community, you just smell a fragrance and take it as it is. None of that stuff really matters. You have no concept of what's old smelling versus what's new. Either it smells good or it doesn't, right? And that was my initial reaction with Black Suede. And yeah, looking back on it now, 20 years later, I can see it being a 1980 fragrance. I can see it had a lot of things that were very contemporary in 1980. The best way to describe Black Suede for someone who doesn't know the fragrance, it's kind of like a three-way tango between Aramis by Estee Lauder, which came out in the 60s, Lagerfeld Cologne, which came out in the 70s, and it has some like barbershop-y, Old Spice kind of nuances, which also go way back into the 30s when that first came out. So it's a leather sheep, it's also an oriental, it's also an amber, it's also a bit of a barbershop fragrance. So it's like a lot of stuff. And, it's hard to really categorize, but for simplicity's sake, I'll say it's basically an amber leather with aldehydes, an aldehyde amber leather fragrance. And it's very cozy to me. I still think it's kind of sexy. I don't think it has a lot of animalic, virile sort of I'm going to bend you over a table kind of a thing, like, some of the more raunchy stuff that people would be really into. It's not that level of sexy, and it's also not like super sweet Ethel Maltol club banger kind of a sexy either. So it's not like an Eros or something or a 1 million. It's more of a confident kind of sexy. And before I move on to the next fragrance, I will state for you vintage heads out there, you deep vintage guys, that Black Suede is one of the rare examples of a fragrance actually getting better when it's reformulated. And I say this because the original Avon formula, which ran from about 1980 until about 1990, is actually simpler, cleaner, more barbershop, not as interesting as the formula that IFF created when Avon, starting in 87, 88, Avon actually closed their internal labs. And they hooked up with Anne Gottlieb at the time, and she was transitioning them away from internal development into using oil houses like everyone else does. So some of their older fragrances that sold really well, IFF doesn't have all the materials for that stuff. So they had to recompose the fragrances with their materials. And in some cases, there was no difference at all. In some cases, the fragrance got worse, which is where the whole shadow of its former self thing comes into play. People go, oh yeah, it got reformulated, it's crap now. But in the case of Black Suede, the reformulation, which came out in about 98, 99, is actually an improvement because the aldehydes are better, the leather note is more present, the spices are more potent, and they actually made the fragrance more complex. You'll notice there's a bit more clove in the IFF version from 98 onwards. You'll notice there's also a bit of orris, and there was no orris at all. It's probably an INO, it's probably not real orris, but there was no orris at all detectable in the original formula. The original formula is actually very simple, because Avon generally made very simple fragrances. When they were doing it themselves in-house, their formulas were just very pared down. They didn't do real big, complex Guerlain type stuff. They've never done that. So I would recommend getting the version from the 90s, which looks like the 80s bottle, except take the S logo and replace it with script. It just says Black Suede on it. But it looks like the 80s bottle, but it has letters on it instead of just a single S. That's the version to go for if you've never smelled the fragrance. That's the version I fell in love with, and that's my all-time favorite. Now, you can move on to the rest of them. The rest of them I'm not going to spend as much time talking about because there's not as much background to them. But my next most worn fragrance, I think, and one of my all-time favorites, is going to be Azzaro. And the reason for that is simple. Azzaro is just a very sort of timeless, clean, green, aromatic. It's very mature smelling, but at the same time, it's also very versatile. To me, it smells like a high-end men's grooming parlor. I don't mean like a Sport Clips or a hair cuttery or a place like that. I'm talking like the place where it would cost you about $50 to get your hair cut and get a shave with like a straight razor. Real high-end grooming parlor. Not Art of Shaving, not some Clubman Pinot type of deal. I'm talking like the place businessmen and doctors and stuff go to get their hair cut. Lawyers, white-collar workers. They want to spend money. They want to look good. They go to these higher-end men's grooming parlors, and you walk away with something like the smell of Azzaro. It's what the products smell like. It's what the hair products smell like. It's whatever they're using to shave the face with, the shampoo. That, American Crew products try to really copy the smell of Azzaro. They don't do it super well, but it's what they go for. So that's the vibe I get. You just always smell clean. You always smell groomed. You always smell perfect when you wear Azzaro. And that's one of the reasons why I wore so much of it when I discovered it. Next along, we have Dior Eau Sauvage. One of the first truly high-end designers I ever came across in my life. And I had enough money to actually start buying stuff at Macy's at that point. So we're talking mid-2000s now. And when I discovered that fragrance, I just thought it was so, it had a really green aromatic smell, but it was also very fresh. That jasmine in it was just really, really something I'd never been exposed to at the time. And it smells very refined. It's not very heavy fragrance. It's very light. But when I discovered it, I just thought I smelled so classy and refined. And because it was very transparent fragrance, Edmund Runitska, the father of the style that now Jean-Claude Elena and eventually Pierre Bourdon would also perpetuate, that sort of transparent, semi-synthetic style. Edmund Runitska really started that whole thing. There's just a lot you can say about Eau Sauvage, but I'm not going to say more. It was just one of those mind-opening fragrances for me. It's a fragrance that really cracked the door open into exploring more possibilities with fragrances. Like, before I discovered Eau Sauvage, I wasn't a frag head per se. I wasn't someone who was interested in learning about the wheres and whys and the whats. I was just content in finding things on the shelf and smelling them and then buying them, or from an Avon catalog, whatever. But Eau Sauvage was that first real, oh my god, I want to learn more about this now because of how great this is. And then you can follow that right up with Moustache by Rochas, another Runitska fragrance. This fragrance was so urinous, so pissy, so sour and animalic. It was like a real knock you on your back. And at first I hated it. Like, I was like, what is this? But then, just like Koros, something was like, hey, I want to keep smelling this. And then before you know, I was in love with the stuff, and I was wearing it constantly. And I remember all my friends hated when I wore Moustache. When I would put on, because I had the concentrate version, so I would put a bunch of Moustache on and I would go out. And they were like, oh God, you're wearing that grandma fragrance again. You smell like a catheter bag or something. They would really tear into me. But honestly, that just made me wear it more. Because when I find out that something irritates you, especially if you're a friend of mine, and you're very vocal about how something irritates you, it just makes me want to do it more. Like the inner gremlin in me just wants to go, okay, well then I'm going to do it more just to bother you. And here we are today. I've finished a bottle of that already, and I've got backups, so I really love it. And then we're going to round out this on list with the last one of my all-time favorites. And this one might actually surprise you, because if you look at my listed wares on Base Notes, it's not really up there. Well, it's starting to get up there. But Terre d'Hermès. Terre d'Hermès is a fragrance I discovered later in my fragrance journey. Only within I want to say the last 5 years or so. So it's not something I've had for 20 years like the other ones I've had for a very long time. This fragrance I've only had for about 5 years. And I've worn it a lot. And it's one of the only fragrances in recent years that I've fallen so hard for that I had to go and buy all the flankers.
I fell so in love with this fragrance and this fragrance line in general that once I got Terre d'Hermes, I had to go out and get the Parfum. I had to get the Eau Très Fresh, which is now sadly discontinued. I had to get the Eau Intense Vetiver, and then the most recent one, the Eau Givre. And I just love them. I love them all. Jean-Claude Elena is a genius, and I love his other fragrances too. Some of his older stuff is a little different than his newer stuff. Like Essence Rare doesn't smell anything like his current style, but it's one of his early ones. Terre d'Hermes, though, is kind of the thing that's going to define his career as a perfumer, though. I feel like it is, because it is such a traditional French fragrance with the chypre structure, the patchouli, the oak moss, the cedarwood. But yet at the same time, it's also very futuristic. It has this transparency to it. It has these mineral notes in it. It has a very interesting display of vetiver that you don't really see in most other fragrances that use vetiver. It uses vetiver in a way that's not smoky. It's not super nutty. It's not like your Guerlains or your Givenchy's. It's a very different kind of vetiver. And then, of course, the grapefruit, the mandarin and the grapefruit. So it's like everything that makes a chypre what a chypre is, but then done in such a futuristic way with such unorthodox materials that it's like a subversion. Really, it's like an actual subversion of the chypre structure. And the traditionalists roll over in their grave. They hate it. Like, that's just, I want my civet, I want my polecat, I want my heavy camphor patchouli, I want my big plonk of oak moss. And I'm like, get over yourself. Okay? Time marches on, whether you choose to or not. Time marches on. And I love seeing something classic being done in an innovative, modern way. And I love the fact that Terre d'Hermes wears very present. It's very around you. It's transparent and light, so it flits and flicks through your senses. It doesn't suffocate you. It's not a particularly opaque fragrance. It's not a particularly thick fragrance. But to say it's not strong is a lie. It's a bold-faced lie. It's a very strong fragrance. It's just such a sort of singular strength, a very potent, piercing kind of strength that comes and goes. It's that transparency, the musk profile, the way the ISOE Super is done. And it's a kind of fragrance that you can enjoy in fits and starts all day long. And unless you're crazy and spray like 15 sprays of it, if you go normal dosage, you'll never really get anosmic to it. People who say that they get anosmic to Terre d'Hermes, I scratch my head at them like, how? How are you getting anosmic to this fragrance? It must be because you're just going ham or whatever. But me, even when I was having like sinus issues and couldn't really wear a lot of fragrances, I could still wear Terre d'Hermes. 1 or 2 sprays in judicious areas, and I would just have a nice, soft, light, detectable bubble of it. And I could ratchet that up as need be. And the Parfum is a little bit heavier, a little bit rounder, so if you want a little more oomph, the Parfum is the way to go. Eau Très Fresh was really cool. It was kind of floral and had the rose and the marine accord in it. The vetiver speaks for itself. I don't need to tell you what that's about. And of course, the Eau Givre is a bit controversial because it has those the icy notes, the hot, the pepper, the mentholated stuff going on. Not everybody really digs that. I mean, I like it. I think it's cool, but not everybody really digs that. And there it is. There you have it. Some of my all-time favorite fragrances delivered to you in unlist fashion. No numbers, no sequences, no graphics. None of that usual stuff. So, hope you enjoyed watching this. Bye-bye.